Thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Well, we're 2012 and we've got a new presidential race upon us. That's right, President already in office, Barack Obama, and it seems like his front runner is Mr. Mitt Romney. And already the mudslinging and the nastiness, well, it's been going on for a while anyway between these two, but it gets interesting to realize that if you look deeper into the history of these political tactics of people tearing each other down, having hearsays and what name you, that this has been going on for quite a while. In fact, our guest today has a book simply titled Slinging Mud, Rude Nicknames, Scurrilous Slogans, and Insulting Slang from 2 Centuries of American Politics. We're going to be exploring that today as we talk about this with our guest, Rosemary Osler, who is the author of other books such as Let's Talk Turkey and Dewdrops. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Miss Rosemary Osler. Rosemary, thank you for joining us here on the program.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Absolutely funny book here, but what's really interesting to know is that even though maybe people this day and age who may see or participate or listen to political campaigns may think that they're hearing new things, but what's really interesting is that as you read through this book, you realize some of this stuff really goes back quite a ways.
Yeah, that's right. I think that the themes of negative campaigning, say my opponent is an elitist, my opponent's not smart enough, corruption, getting too much money from Congress. I think all of these things, have been talked about since almost since the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did you decide to go this direction with your life and write something like this?
Well, I really started approaching it from the perspective of words. I'm a linguist and I write about American slang, and I was interested as I was doing some research on my last book to discover that a lot of the slang terms that we use are either from politics or they are applied to politics. So I just started looking into that and collected a lot of negative terms and, of course, some positive ones, but focused on the negative.
Mm-hmm. Now, what I've noticed, too, is that you can hear people around you sometimes when they talk about, for instance, the presidential race, and you tend to sense from the conversations, people say, why can't these people just be nice? Why can't they play fair? Why can't they, for instance, just focus on what they'll do in office rather than what they think their opponent is incapable of doing should they get in? So what is this that, as you describe in your book, seems to be a real American pastime, like hot dogs and baseball, for instance, that we feel this compelling need in America to run politics with the idea of slamming the opponent rather than focusing on what it is you're supposed to be doing for the country?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people probably start out their campaigns by feeling that they are going to take the high road and they are not going to do attack campaigns, but attack campaigns work really well. I think a good negative campaign works just about as well as anything you can do, and people, I think, are just going to keep doing it.
Mm-hmm. I know that it wasn't too long ago that I was watching a documentary. It was called The Blues Man. It's about Lee Atwater. Is that someone you're familiar with?
Oh, yes, sure.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And we know that according to this documentary that he was pretty much responsible for getting President Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush elected into office because he was just pretty nasty at being able to do things like this. And in fact, as it described when you talk about how it gets downright ugly, that it was the campaign between Michael Dukakis and George H.W. Bush, as they say in this documentary, that led to basically destroying Michael Dukakis' life. Let's talk about that one. That's kind of about as low gets, according to your book.
Well, a lot of people really felt at the time when the Willie Horton ads came out that politics had hit a new low, and a new low, even lower than usual. And I think a lot of people were really shocked and horrified by the ads, but nonetheless they were very effective.
Mm-hmm. Talk about that a little bit as to why they were effective and what they were.
Well, I think they kind of pushed buttons for certain sorts of people. The person who wrote the ads suggested that this sort of image of an African-American man on television who had been accused of violence and had committed violence, that it was a kind of, I think he said, every suburban mom's worst nightmare or something like that. So they were really playing on certain kinds of themes that are very powerful, and they were pushing the right buttons, and they were not overt about it, but they just did it with imagery and suggestions.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that you also coined terms in here, at least that were coined through these things throughout the book. For instance, like pork barrel spending. Mm-hmm. Talk about what that's all about, because it's interesting to hear these and realize this went way back and that there was a reason that term was even created in the first place.
Well, it does go much farther back than you would think. And
because I heard it, to me, as recently as during John McCain's run, and you would hear pork barrel spending, I think, honestly, was the first time that I had heard it. Mm-hmm. And so, anyway, go ahead.
Well, pork barrels, of course, were an important thing in the old days when people would salt pork, and they would have that for their meat during the winter. And so the idea that you're going to have something a little extra, some little extra bit of money that you can play with is kind of what it turned into for the government. So these are Congress people who are dipping into the pork barrel to provide good stuff for their constituents. So I guess that pork barrel spending, in some way, it depends on your perspective. I think the reason it keeps happening is that a lot of people like it if it's coming their way.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Talk about some of the other, I guess, catchphrases, if you will, that may be being used, that are probably being used today, that have a pretty deep root.
Well, one that has gotten a lot of popularity, and you can really still find it everywhere recently, and say if you search for it on the Internet, you'll find a lot of hits, is malefactors of great wealth, which was coined by Teddy Roosevelt to talk about large corporations, and he really wanted to go after them, and he wanted to break up the trusts and so on. He was really against what he saw as corporate corruption and undue influence and so on, and that has really made a big comeback since 2008 and the Wall Street problems. And so that's a good example of one that has this good longevity because it keeps being relevant.
Fascinating stuff here. Just recently I was reading a book called Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, I believe it was. Mm-hmm. And in there he was talking about how sometimes we have subtle biases that favor things that may not turn out to be favorable in the long run. And in your book you actually feature one of the people he was talking about in there, which happened to be President Warren G. Harding.
Oh, yeah.
There was a guy that was charismatic, he was good looking, but in your book you go into more detail than he did. He said, here was a guy that was really purely elected because he fit the Adonis look. He just looked good to be president, Mm-hmm. And but then he went on to say, look, he was one of the worst presidents we ever had. And then I read in your chapter when you talk about the lunatic fringe, it said, for instance, his tendency was to bloviate, which in a minute I'd like you, if you could tell me what that word means. But it says a prominent Democrat described Harding's speeches as an army of pompous phrases moving across the landscape in search of an idea. Yeah. When I read that, I cracked up laughing. Funny stuff.
Yeah, that was kind of the perception of Harding, and he did use this word normalcy, which people at the time that thought was not really a word, that he had actually made it up. And in fact, I think it is a word, but it's not very common. But it just seems
it'll
like
become
typical.
A real word when we say it enough.
Yeah, well, people use it all the time now, so I guess that he contributed that. But he was really, I think, a typical sort of candidate that you would vote for because he was somebody you might like to have a beer with. He was very appealing. He was easygoing and friendly, and people liked him. And he was nice looking.
Hmm. I kind of liked, a little further down as they were talking, saying of him that Harding wrote the worst English that he had ever encountered. It reminded him of strings of wet sponges, of tattered washing on the line, of dogs barking idiotically through endless nights.
Yeah,
Thought it was really that bad, was it?
Yeah, that Mencken thought it was. He really couldn't stand Harding.
Now, even though pretty much a lot of phrases and even in some cases tactics as you described come through history, they sort of stand the test of time. The landscape of how it's used is certainly a lot different today than it was back in the day, and as I would liken it, back in the day, people, like back in the 1800s, if you want to consider early part of the 1900s, because there was more print and potentially radio, it was more oratory. So, whereas today it's more sound bites, people just bits of information. So you really had to have your vernacular down to be really good in things like this. Would you agree that it was pretty much different in that respect than it is today?
Yeah, I think so. People campaigned a lot. Well, first of all, candidates did not do their own campaigning until well into the 20th century. It was considered tacky to really do your own campaigning. So a lot of this was with surrogates, with people's supporters, but they were doing things like writing newspaper editorials, writing letters to the editor, and there was a lot more just verbal kind of discussion, arguments, longer discussions than sound bites, and they didn't have the advantage of being able to, say, post something on YouTube and have it go viral. It was all a lot slower. And that didn't stop them from being nasty. They really got their licks in, but it was all a little bit slower and I think a little bit less overwhelming.
That's for sure. Lipstick on a Pig was one that kind of cropped up here somewhat recently over the last several years, but that really goes back to a phrase that was actually much different, as I understand.
Lipstick on a pig. Well, it meant dressing something up to try and make something that was inherently unattractive look a little bit better. And I think that is how President Obama used it when he was campaigning. He said something like, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. But because of, unfortunately, the whole lipstick thing had recently come up because Sarah Palin had made a joke about lipstick, pit bulls and lipstick, that it kind of clicked in people's minds, and I think it kind of shows the sort of subliminal ways that people get these messages. And it became a sort of issue of whether Obama had insulted Palin.
Now, Abraham Lincoln, by many, was considered to be probably our country's finest president. But even he, I just not too long ago had interviewed with Civil War diaries, and it was pretty fascinating not only to talk about what the Civil War truly was versus what we were meant to understand about it, for instance, in school. But even then, you see this guy who seems kind of calm and collective, but she says, no, he was as ferocious and nasty as just about anybody else could be. Talk about who Abraham Lincoln was and what you discovered in your book when it came to slinging mud.
Well, he was a much better campaigner than people might think, and he was a good speaker. He was a wonderful stump speaker. But he also was very much attacked by Democrats because he did have this kind of folksy style, and he was called a fourth-rate lecturer who cannot speak good grammar. And he was also attacked because he was physically unattractive, and that's something that you probably wouldn't really get today as people, at least in mainstream political conversations such as newspapers. You wouldn't really get people doing that kind of thing, but he was attacked as being this big hatchet-faced, gangly person, and did he really look appropriately political? But he was actually a much smarter campaigner than people might think.
Mm-hmm. Now, the term bleeding hearts, how many times have we heard that? It tends to be mushed together with the word liberal. Now, liberal used to have a much different meaning and feeling than it does today. And certainly blending those two, bleeding heart liberals, makes somebody sound like, they're just somebody out there that's feeling bad for people who just can't really fend for themselves. Talk about those two terms and, like how Bleeding Hearts started and what liberals originally meant, how it morphed into what it is today.
Well, the word liberal has a long history, and it really kind of evolved from, I think, something that would be a little bit more like what we would call a conservative to what it means now, which, depending on who uses it, progressive or a socialist or just somebody who's in the Democratic Party, kind of depends. But the interesting thing about Bleeding Heart, about the way liberal has evolved with Bleeding Heart, is that Bleeding Heart liberal meant that you had, of course, sympathy with other people, and with the sort of implication that maybe it led you to do things that weren't very sensible or practical because you felt sorry for the downtrodden. But now people talk more about things like latte liberals or limousine liberals, which it kind of implies
cappuccino conservatives.
Yeah.
Why not?
Well, it sort of implies that it's all about you, not about your concern for the downtrodden, but about a kind of lifestyle that you as a liberal have, that you're out of touch with reality, So it's kind of evolved in this interesting way, I think.
Now here's another one, gobbledygook. You'd think that'd come from like a Disney cartoon film, but no, that's another one.
Yeah, that was just a made-up word, and it really caught on. It's a nice word. I think people enjoy using it because it just sort of seems to express what it means.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating stuff in here. Now, when you were doing the research for Slinging Mud, were there some surprises about presidents or things that you said, I thought it was always this way, but wow, that kind of just changes the way I see things?
Well, I was kind of surprised by how early negative campaigning started and by how much it was really, in many ways, similar to what negative campaigning is now. I don't think I had too many changes of idea about presidents. I was impressed with Grover Cleveland, who is a person that I think most of us probably don't think about or know very much about these days, but he was one of the few people that I looked at who actually chose not to sling mud at a time when it could have really been useful for him. And he discovered something about his opponent, James Blaine. This is the 1884 election. And Blaine's people had been attacking Grover Cleveland pretty severely, and he could have used this material against Blaine, but he chose not to. He said, let the other side have a monopoly on the mud. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of interesting, and he got elected. So he chose not to fling mud, and he managed to succeed anyway. So that's kind of a heartening thought, I think.
Now, was there ever a time when, let's say, a candidate was really pretty good at doing this, where it actually backfired on them?
I don't think it backfires very often, and I think that people will say that voters will say that they're shocked by things, and they'll be disgusted, like with the Willie Horton ads, for example, but it kind of sticks in your mind anyway, even if you're trying not to be influenced by it. Actually, one of the people, speaking of James G. Blaine, one of the people I can think of whose negative campaigning backfired, it was something not that he said, but that someone campaigning for him said. He called Democrats the party of Romanism and rebellion, which was a reference to the Civil War, and also the Romanism reference was a kind of a slap at a lot of the Irish American immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a mistake, because then Cleveland's people really got out and publicized this remark. Of course, all Irish Americans voted for Cleveland. So that was really useful. So that might have been one time when it really backfired. Usually it doesn't backfire, though. Usually it's, on the whole, it's helpful.
I just find it fascinating, especially when you look at what you wrote about the George W. Bush and John Kerry campaign,
Mm-hmm.
you know, about how relatively distinguished John Kerry actually was, and because of a slight or a change of decision on his part, he just got hammered where they were just calling him flip-flop. So, you know, all of a sudden you don't know if you can count on this guy, even though he's got a tremendous service record compared to George W. Bush.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that their ad technique used servicemen speaking out against Kerry who weren't even part of what Kerry was doing as far as Vietnam was concerned,
Mm-hmm.
and then turning around and then using it in such a way to say, well, you know, maybe he just can't decide any flip-flops, but at least you know where I stand. It may not be good, but you know where I stand. And I'm thinking, can Americans actually ever discern these things anymore? I mean, are we capable of making good decisions when it comes to our politics, or are we going to ever move in that direction?
Well, I think that people really are influenced by what comes out first. And if I was
Sure.
going to give advice to a political candidate, I'd say get your licks in first.
Like George H.W. Bush did.
Yeah, and I think that really makes a difference, and I think that's what happened here. You've got the power of these quick sound bites. Flip-flopper's a great word. It's got alliteration, and, you know, it's easy to understand what it means. And so that was really useful. And also they just got their criticism in first, and once you do that, it's very hard for the person you're attacking to respond and say, no, wait, it's really more complicated. This is what really happened. By that time, people aren't paying attention. And I think Americans, as a lot of people have suggested, that Americans aren't focused, you know, for any long length of time on any one issue these days. And when you do have a lot of internet campaigning, a lot of television sound bites, a lot of really quick things moving in succession, it is harder to get the whole story, I think.
And it seems we're also revisiting an old campaign when, I don't mean by too old, where it's the economy, stupid.
Oh, yeah.
And here we are back on that again. You know, it's funny how when you take a look at politics, you know, they pick an issue they believe is something that's going to stir people, and obviously the economy does, but, you know, when you look back at what Bill Clinton did, for instance, it was pretty interesting how all that played out, because I remember watching, again, I'm a documentary fan. I love watching this stuff just to kind of find out more than what you see in the sound bites and so forth. But that when they talked about the economy in a debate, H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, when he was running for office the first time, that they didn't feel that either of the two candidates, that means mainstream people, understood, especially Bill Clinton, because they felt that he was wealthy, that he didn't understand their plights. And he says, you know, I'll tell you how this affects me. It affects me when I see my next door neighbor this and that. And so he didn't make it about him as far as the comment went or the question, but he made it about that audience member and connected with them. And unfortunately, even as you said in your book, and they showed the same thing here, the mistake H.W. made is he looked at his watch like he had other things he'd rather be doing. And that really blew it for him.
Yeah, that's right. And it does show, I think, the power of these little clips and these little sound bites. And
they're ready to bounce on anything anymore.
Yeah, and there is a lot more of that. And I think one reason people feel so overwhelmed by negative campaigning these days is that it is just really nonstop. And you're seeing 24-hour news coverage and the clips and the YouTube. I'm sure if you went on YouTube, you could find a picture of the former President Bush glancing at his wristwatch. Lots of other things like that.
Now, when most young people today, and I'm talking about people, young kids in grade school, junior high, when we think of how we've learned about the presidents of the United States, George Washington, of course, is our first alleged founding father. Mm-hmm. But as apparently you look through history, he wasn't in fact the first president, with somebody else. But so you have this sense of grandeur about this guy, but your book again, I mean, we show that all of us have this sort of interesting, darker, not so colorful side. Tell us something about George Washington that maybe these young kids wouldn't know of, especially from their history books.
Well, as far as campaigning, actually, he does seem to live up to his good press, which was that he did not believe in negative campaigning. He didn't really believe in political parties, and he really did try to stay above the fray, and he might be the last presidential candidate.
So he was literally the first president, but in a particular way.
Yeah. That didn't stop people from attacking him.
Right.
But he tried to be, I think, pretty circumspect. So that's kind of a good, impressive thing to know about him, I think.
And with as intelligent as even our generation and even the generations today, I think something like this should be put into history books so that people have a better understanding growing up. This is what the process is, folks. So I think that you make better decisions about what's really going on in front of you. Do you think that might help, or do you think the political landscape is maybe always going to be this way or even get worse?
Well, of course, the more people can find out and the more details they can have and the stronger sense of history they have, I think the better it is. But I don't think that negative campaigning will go away anytime soon. I think that it is turned out to be a useful tool for people.
Sure. Now, Rosemary, tell me, as you were researching your book, Slinging Mud here, what delighted you the most about putting this all together?
Well, I did find out a lot that was kind of eyebrow-raising about the campaigns. As I said, the fact that the mudslinging's been going on for so long. And I also enjoyed discovering some of the words. I have a favorite word which I would like to see come back. It's snollygoster, which we don't hear anymore.
Snollygoster.
Snollygoster, which means a politician who will do anything to get elected, and I think that's such a wonderful word. I'd love to see it come back.
That's right up there with the rats and the attorneys experiment, right?
Right.
Oh, fascinating stuff. The book is Slinging Mud, and when you pick this up, it isn't something you have to read from page 1 to the end. You can actually pop in and read about the different presidential campaigns throughout, the history and, whatever ones appeal to you here. A lot of fun to read, and I'd like to thank you so much for being on the program. Rosemary, do you have a website people can find out more?
Yes, I do. It's just rosemary-osler.com, and I've been posting words on there from this campaign, from the 2012 campaign. So if people want to see what words are being slung around right now, they can check there.
Okay, and now, if you can, since we didn't get this, describe or define the word bloviate.
Oh, bloviate. That's such a good word. And Harding claimed that it originated in Ohio, which might be true. But it just means somebody, it's like a version of a blowhard. It just means somebody who really blows a lot of wind out their mouth. So,
like Blagojevich.
Yeah. Well, there could be a connection there. Yeah.
There could be. Ms. Rosemary Osler, thank you for joining us here on the program. A lot of fun. Definitely thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you, the listeners out there. Again, the book is Slinging Mud, so that way you can see through all the hype and just kind of figure out what's really going on when the boxing gloves go on and the bell is rung in the ring. We encourage you to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com, the number 50. We do have a free weekly e-newsletter. Sign up for that, and also be sure to visit us at our blog. We will archive this particular show here so you can listen at your convenience and share with others as well. I'm Daniel Davis. This is Beyond 50, and remember, live your day past halfway.